Greetings, everyone. I would like to welcome Dr. Janice R. Franklin, who is the Dean of the Levi Watkins Learning Center and Project Director of the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University. Welcome, Dr. Franklin.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Alabama State University Board of Trustees, President Ross, Drs. Pettis and Roll, and other members of our administration, faculty, staff, and students. I am happy to also extend greetings on behalf of the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University, the university at the heart of the civil rights movement. Our mission in the National Center is to serve as a research center, a living museum, and a repository of information relative to the study of social justice, civil rights, and the culture of African Americans. We are indeed honored to have been awarded this special opportunity to advance the cause of our mission through the Reebok Human Rights Award Program in collaboration with our esteemed partners, Reebok, the American Civil Liberties Union, and members of the Alabama State University Task Force under the direction of Ms. Anderson and Dr. Davis May. Throughout history, we have witnessed the brutal effects of systemic racism, which perpetuates inequality and injustice across the world. Now more than ever, there is an urgency to learn from this history and right the wrongs that have resulted in man's inhumanity to man due to one's race, caste, religion, or other forms of discrimination and inequality. Today, as the past meets the present, we are faced with new issues that challenge racial justice. We must answer the clarion call to eradicate discrimination and create the beloved community as envisioned by Dr. Martin Luther King, encouraging new generations of our youth to build a better world with freedom and justice for all. The prestigious Reebok Human Rights Award Program is a major step toward this end. It is in keeping with the mission of Alabama State University and other historically Black colleges and universities to educate and elevate the children coming on, a phrase used by civil rights activist Dr. E.D. Nixon, the father of the Montgomery bus boycott. Thank you, Reebok and other partners, because your great vision for human rights supports the work of our Center for Civil Rights at ASU, and we thank you for your investment in our future. May I close these readings by also thanking our presenters, local partners, and members of the ASU administration for their support of this great initiative. We are energized by your work, and we look forward to today's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin, and thank you for continuing to be a stalwart at the front of this work that we continue in relationship to human rights. And so I'd like to begin by having just a brief discussion around what we understand global human rights to mean and to be. So first, who decides? Who decides what a basic human right is? Because we are human beings and we are indelibly flawed. Even when we attempt to enact the concept, we struggle, we get it wrong. That is the case even in our basic understanding of what is right versus wrong, and as I like to phrase it, acceptable versus unacceptable. So in human services work, we lean on the global measure of human rights. In the formation of the United Nations in the mid-20th century, after the devastation of World War II, with its mission to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I would like to share a few of the foundational premises of the 30 declarative articles. Article 1, freedom to be free and equal. We're born with it. It's not something that can be granted. It's not something that can be given. We are born with the freedom to be free, the right to be free, the right to be equal in dignity and rights. Article number 2, freedom from discrimination. This simply says that everyone is entitled to be free from being discriminated against, and that is without distinction of any kind, from race to birth or other statuses. We have the right to have no distinction being made on the basis of political or jurisdictional or international status. Article 3, the right to be and feel safe. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security. Article number 4, the freedom to literally be free. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Article number 7, the right to equal application of the law. And so, in essence, there are no imposed hierarchies here. All of the aforementioned are among the Declaration's basic civil, political, social, and economic and cultural rights, from the right to peaceful assembly to the right to a good education, the right to be paid fairly, no hierarchy. They are all connected, and as simple as it seems, we still get it wrong. And it's difficult to respond to these violations, even though we have the expectations that they're going to exist. Primarily because of the exclusion of developing and emerging economies as we develop our understanding of what is considered a human right, there tends to be a focus on civil, political, and individual rights over socio-political and collective rights. Also, our understanding of human rights shifts as we continue to morph as a society. And because humanity is dynamic and ever-changing, we must pay close attention to how we define these needs. And so I'm excited about moving on to hearing from a scholar in history and the archivist here at Alabama State University and an associate professor. Dr. Howard Robinson will come to us and speak to youth activism and nonviolent resistance. Welcome, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you. I appreciate that you sort of started our conversation with this discussion of human rights. And I want to further add to our definitions by discussing civil rights and really so that we could juxtapose the two concepts. And there is overlap. But civil rights are those rights that are enjoyed by virtue of a person being a citizen of a state or a nation. And so in the United States, for instance, our civil rights grow from or stem from the United States Constitution, particularly the First Amendment. But so we look at freedom of speech, due process, equal protection under the law, freedom of religion as some of the core civil rights that are articulated in our foundational documentation, our foundational constitution, and that are supposed to protect all American citizens. And so I think we need to look at the modern civil rights movement in that context, and particularly how it played out in the 1950s and 60s throughout the United States, more specifically in Alabama, and really how it intersected Alabama State University, where we are today. Let's look at, for context, look at the Brown versus Board of Education case, which was really the gateway to the modern civil rights movement in 1954. But really, this case, which looked at educational systems throughout the United States and argued that these systems, because they were predicated on or could separate or segregate people based on race, the Supreme Court ruled that that was a fundamental violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so, and actually the 14th Amendment and that Equal Protection Clause, it really is the grist or the foundation for much of the litigation that goes on, constitutional litigation that goes on in this nation, particularly after the 1950s. And so, but there's a particular clause in that passage or in the 14th Amendment that I really want us to pay attention to. That is, and I'm paraphrasing, well, I'm quoting, but I'm picking up the quote and saying, "Nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So all citizens are supposed to enjoy equal protection of the law. And so clearly, people of African descent in the United States did not enjoy equal protection of the law, and in some cases may still not. However, what we see is an effort in the modern civil rights movement to force this nation to extend and to protect its citizens and their enjoyment of equal protection. And so in order to do that, there was another constitutional component that is going to be called on, and that's the First Amendment's right to peaceably assemble and redress government. And so in the First Amendment, Congress, the Constitution says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or, and this is really critical, the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. And I would argue that much of the modern civil rights movement is an effort on the part of the people of African descent in the United States to petition the government to redress grievances. So we see this in the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. The bus boycott brings together these two concepts. So people, and really, you could look at the Montgomery bus boycott as having originated right here at Alabama State University with Professor Joanne Robinson. After the arrest of Rosa Parks, she meets with women in the Women's Political Council, a Black civic organization centered here at Alabama State, and they agree to move forward with a bus boycott, right? And then they call in Edie Nixon, who then calls Martin Luther King, and they organize the community around this concept of a bus boycott. And what are they attempting to do? They're attempting to use their voice, to use this idea of direct action or nonviolent direct action, right? Speaking to what in the Constitution it says, people to peaceably assemble to petition the government. And so the Montgomery bus boycott was adhering to that concept of peaceable assembly. And so Black people in Montgomery then organized around this bus boycott, and they intersected Alabama State again, not only in the origins of the bus boycott, but also its execution. Rufus Lewis, who was a librarian and a football coach, headed up the transportation committee. Joanne Robinson, again, professor of English at Alabama State, headed up the newsletter and the negotiation. She was on a negotiation team. But then you also had students. Reverend Solomon Say led a student component of the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization created to execute the bus boycott. And so students ran errands, they handed out leaflets. They were really in the nuts and bolts of the Montgomery bus boycott, but they also sat at the feet of those elders and came to understand how to execute a nonviolent civil disobedient campaign. And so in the final analysis, you have the Browder versus Gale case, which again is a case that actually ends the bus boycott, right? This litigation that is filed by an Alabama State graduate, Fred Gray, on behalf of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and argues that segregated busing in the city of Montgomery violates the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, and the Supreme Court agrees. And so you have really the first major salvo of the modern civil rights movement, the direct action phase of the civil rights movement, sort of intersect this institution. Then you have, and 5 years later, you have the 1960 student sit-ins, and clearly Alabama State students played a prominent role. And so you had almost 30 Alabama State students are going to walk downtown to the Montgomery County Courthouse and occupy seats in the eatery at the courthouse and ask for service. And so the courthouse refused to serve these students, and suggesting that they did not serve. As a public entity, they did not serve people of African descent. And so those students in their actions were appealing to their First Amendment right to redress government through their sit-in activity. And so students like Bernard Lee and James McFadden, James Richburg, Eleanor Moody Shepherd, they participated in this campaign that that led to the desegregation, eventually leads to the desegregation of eateries in Montgomery. So collectively, sit-ins, that first year in 1960, 70,000 students around the United States participate in sit-ins. And so Alabama State students are part of that larger picture. Students from Alabama State, 4 students, particularly from Alabama State, join hundreds of students who gather in North Carolina at Shaw University and create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so again, as students start to organize and to effectively participate in the modern civil rights movement in an organized fashion, Alabama State students are a critical part of that. We see this also in the Freedom Rides the very next year, 1961. There's two Supreme Court cases, the Morgan versus Virginia and the Boynton versus Virginia. In those cases, the Morgan case, the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional to segregate in interstate bus travel. And in the Boynton case, the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional to segregate in travel-related activities in the terminal and in the restrooms related to interstate travel. And the Interstate Commerce Commission just refused to enforce the legislation and enforce the ruling. And so Black and white protesters rode these interstate buses throughout from DC through Virginia, the Carolinas, and they were savagely beat when they got to Alabama, in Anniston first, and then in Birmingham, and then again in Montgomery. And so you had 2 Alabama State students who were going to participate in a whole wave of freedom rides that are going to occur until the federal government relented. And in the summer of '61, the Kennedy administration forces or prompts the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce the desegregation of interstate bus travel. And so again, you have students participating in this First Amendment right to redress government, and then seeing their calls for justice and desegregation answered by the Kennedy administration. And finally, I want to talk about the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Campaign in March. And this is another civil rights issue, and that it speaks to the 15th Amendment. And in the 15th Amendment, the Constitution says the right, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so what Southern states did, including Alabama, was they implemented literacy tests. So they said you can't vote if you cannot demonstrate that you could read. This didn't violate your right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It violated it based on your inability to read. Or they passed poll taxes and said, well, if you don't pay a poll tax every year, then you cannot vote. That's not violating your right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It is saying that people who cannot afford to pay a poll tax cannot vote. Many of those people happen to be of African American descent. And so you see a whole series of rules implemented that prohibited people from voting based on factors other than race or previous condition of servitude. And so again, the Selma to Montgomery March is an overt way for people in Montgomery and from around this nation to collect in Montgomery and to appeal to the federal government for redress. And so you see almost 800 students join Alabama State alum Richard Boone, and they are going to leave Alabama State en masse, march across town, and join the Selma to Montgomery March as it comes into the city. Again, from March 9th, just after Bloody Sunday, to March 21st, for almost 2 weeks, protests are occurring between Alabama State University and downtown in the capital almost daily. There's actually several riots break out during that period. These protests are covered by newspapers throughout the nation. And so they add to this crescendo of public outrage, calling for the government to redress the grievance of voter discrimination and disenfranchisement. And consequently, you have, after Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery March and student protest, you have the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So in essence, you had Alabama State students really at the core of some of the nation's more critical civil rights actions and campaigns. And these students, faculty, staff, participated in asking the government through their protest, through their voice of collective protest, to ensure the equal protection of the laws as articulated, in the United States Constitution. So anytime we have this conversation about civil rights and human rights, I think Alabama State is appropriate that we're at the table.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. I think that was a wonderful segue into this discussion, and it was right where it needed to be in terms of making the bridge from human rights to what we have been at the center of here at Alabama State University, and to reiterate that history. And so what we're going to do now is to move on to two other guests who are going to talk about some of the emerging issues that affect us now as it relates to human rights. And that would be Jatan Bosby, who is the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, of Alabama, and Dylan Nettles, who is the policy and advocacy director of the ACLU of Alabama. Thank you, Ms. Bosby and Mr. Nettles. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. We very much appreciate this. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jatan Bosby, pronoun she, her, the executive director of the ACLU of Alabama. And we are happy to take part in today's event as we help support the work of ASU's advisory committee as you embark on the task of preparing to support the next generation of social justice and leaders and change agents in partnership with Reebok's Human Rights Award. So today with me, I have the ACLU's Policy and Advocacy Director, Dylan Nettles, and we are going to provide you a general overview of nationwide and state-based priorities in an effort to contextualize the moment that Dr. Robinson so well laid out, and connected to the broader movement of social change that we've seen take shape recently, and that we know is a continuum of the very movement born here in the city of Montgomery. So if we can go ahead to our first slide, thank you so much. So the ACLU is a broad organization. We have 54 statewide affiliates, 1.6 million card-carrying members, 1,750 staff across the country, 10 of those in Alabama. And we focus on 6 key priorities, and that is criminal legal reform, immigrants' rights, LGBTQ equality, privacy, reproductive freedom, and voting rights. Next slide, please. So people are often like, well, what is the ACLU? That is the question that we get. And so the ACLU is a 100-year organization. And it has really been focused on litigation to further protect our civil rights and advance civil liberties. And so, what is the difference in that? And really, civil liberties are the freedoms guaranteed to us by the Constitution and Bill of Rights. And our organization works to advance those, particularly in states and spaces with legislatures and politicians who choose to oppress or restrict them. And civil rights, as we heard, is the basic right for free, unequal, is the right to be free from unequal treatment based on certain protective characteristics, race, gender, other abilities, in settings such as unemployment, education, and we work to protect those rights. You will see the ACLU has a long history of incredible civil liberties issues that we have fought to protect. Loving v. Virginia, Obergefell, which focused on same-sex marriage and couples. And so that is important in dovetailing the work that we continue to do now. Next slide, please. So the nationwide organization, of course, focuses on a number of issues, but right now we are shifting to be even more intentional about how we power build. And that focus is primarily in the South. in an initiative we identify as the Southern Collective. And the Southern Collective is a 12-state collaborative that includes the ACLUs of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. And we're focused on the critical areas of civil rights and civil liberties that are especially present in the Southern region, because we know historically the Deep South has been ground zero for some of the most important civil rights and civil liberties issues today. The goal of the Southern Collective is the work of statewide and regional power building over the next decade. As we know, we are seeing right now the retaliation of what power building does in the South taking shape right now across state legislatures. And what the Southern Collective is focused on doing is ensuring that we are not only power building in the South, but building up the types of leadership that ensures the next decade is one that is focused on equitability, inclusivity, and liberating our region. So I would like to transition to the next slide and our focus on systemic equality. Thank you. The ACLU Systemic Equality Agenda aims to address the impacts of racism in America, from the original sin of slavery to Jim Crow through present day. And our goal is to build a nation where every person can achieve their highest potential, unhampered by structural and institutional racism. And really what this is a charge on the new administration that we are seeing now. And we are focusing this on 4 pillars: reconciling the past, increasing access, building prosperity, and extending empowerment. Can we transition? Thank you. And I'd like to include the highlights of those areas particularly. We know that litigation and lawsuits are simply bookends. There's a lot of work that goes in between that. It is legislative policy, it is grassroots organizing, and it is the public education that we have to focus on to ensure that we are building the community and the individuals needed and working alongside them, not empowering them, but ensuring that we are only increasing our power and impact together to build towards a world and a nation where we are focused on systemic equality, inclusivity, and equitability. Next slide, please. Thank you. The highlights of some of that is the reconciling the past, reparations and advocacy, decriminalizing the school to prison pipeline, extending empowerment, expanding voting rights, and we understand the value of that right here in Alabama and across the South, redistricting, building prosperity, canceling student debt, post-banking financial access, permanent child tax credits, and increasing access is specific to broadband access, further fair housing, and eliminate barriers to reentry for those who are formerly incarcerated. And so we want to ensure that you all understand that to focus on the systemic equality initiatives that the ACLU of Alabama is focusing on, please visit our website at aclualabama.org and also visit our national website, aclu.org, to look into what that systemic equality agenda is focused on and how you can support it in your state. So I'd like to lead into what our priorities are as a statewide affiliate. It is really the focus of the grassroots movement. The Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen take shape has reinforced the importance and the impact of how we do our work here in the state. So the ACLU of Alabama has 3 critical priorities that make up the arc of our work: reproductive freedom, abortion access, criminal legal reform, and expanding voting rights. And today, Dylan Nettles is going to provide you some insight on these issues specifically and how the Alabama legislature and state legislatures across the South are currently working to restrict and suppress these rights. Dylan.
Thank you so much, Shatan. And of course, it's a pleasure to be with you all today, and especially for the purposes of this presentation, where we know that these topics we're discussing today are so relevant to the current discourse across the country and even here in Alabama, as we will just begin to cover. So thank you so much. So I want to start off by talking about one area of just severe importance for the ACLU, both nationally and here at the Alabama affiliate. A few years ago, we launched the Campaign for Smart Justice, which was an ambitious effort to reduce incarceration across the country by 50%. And we were clear upon the release and rollout of this campaign that there were many pathways to get there. We have to look at the role of people who are part of the criminal justice system, or rather the criminal legal system, as often we refer to it. And this includes especially our prosecutors. The ACLU of Alabama was involved in a campaign in 2018 involving the district attorney's race in Jefferson County. This was a race in which we did not support a candidate, but rather we uplifted and underscored that it is of really grave importance that the community understands the role of the district attorney, the role of that prosecutor. And we know that, in fact, they have an incredible amount of power when it comes to sentencing, when it comes to what charges are ultimately pursued, and obviously who is pursued in those charges. And I don't need to tell any of you that the disparate impact of the criminal legal system on Black and Brown communities is substantial, especially here in this state. But we also, of course, had to pursue policy changes. And you see here on your slide that one of the things we named, and we'll be talking about a little bit further as we get into our legislative priorities, is the Habitual Felony Offender Act, which is one of the harshest sentencing laws in the country right here in Alabama, which is, again, disproportionately impacting Black and Brown folks. 3 out of the 4 people who are sentenced to under the Habitual Felony Offender Law in Alabama are Black people. And so we have been adamant that we have to pursue policy changes, but there's also a role administratively here. And you can see we talk about pretrial processes, retroactive application. There's a lot of work that can be done with our Bureau of Pardons and Paroles to ensure that there's an equitable process in these hearings for those who are coming before them, so that they have a chance of release, so that they have another chance to come back and be productive and return to their families, return to their loved ones and people who need them in their communities. And so these are all been points that we've emphasized in this campaign for smart justice. And as you see, we say this is investing in people, not prisons. Next slide, please. Voting rights has been another area. And I have to tell you that this has been a very tough issue. It's, of course, historically been the case here in Alabama. I can't overshadow that. And Dr. Robinson, of course, provided us a really beautiful timeline and history of the activism, especially concerning this topic. But even today, we persist and we continue to run, though, into substantial roadblocks. And of course, I think one of the things that's unique about the ACLU's work is that it is across the courtrooms, it's across communities, and it's also happening in our state legislatures and in Congress. And I don't think I need to tell any of you that this is a very hot topic nationally right now, but we have for years been urging our state lawmakers and local officials, including county clerks and probate judges, to join us in ushering in what is a modernization, really, of voting rights in this state. We lag far behind the rest of the country when it comes to access, as far as early voting, as far as no excuse absentee voting, alternative options like curbside voting. And we believe that these are, unfortunately, the lingering effects of what we know to be, Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow segregation, and the restrictions and barriers to voting rights that have long plagued our community and our state. And even now, we're seeing these attacks across the country against the ways in which really, as communities, we have circumvented and found a way to still show up, found a way to still use our voices and use our power at the ballot box. And so because we've gotten creative, because we've gotten savvy, they have gone further and they're attempting to go further to restrict these rights. And so we are litigating, we are showing up in Congress and in our state legislatures, and we are working actively with community members, especially grassroots leaders, to ensure that we are building an inclusive and powerful movement of people across the state and across this country who absolutely are prepared to defend democracy. Because let's be very clear, we are seeing an attack on democracy. We're seeing an attack on our fundamental rights. We also really want to emphasize that the process of reapportionment and redistricting, is fast approaching us. Right now, We are waiting to, in fact, see what ultimately are going to be the districts that Alabama at the national level may lose or gain as a result of our 2020 census. We will also be waiting to see how that affects ultimately how districts are drawn, of course, within the state with regard to our state legislature. But this is a process which has historically been non-transparent and left far too many people out. And so our work really before us is to ensure that we're educating and making sure that communities understand what this process means and how important it is that we are engaged in it so that we are not, again, cut out of the democratic process. And in each and every election, we are making sure that we are partnering with organizations across the country and across the state to have a network of election protection so that folks can reach out to us at the ACLU, so that they can reach out to their local grassroots leaders who they have those connections to, and report to us when they're seeing these direct barriers, when they're seeing these direct issues that are arising on the day of elections or in the immediate days leading up to them. With regard to accessing, of course, the ballot or being able to go and vote on an election day. So next slide, please. And reproductive rights has been a core issue for a very long time for the ACLU, and unfortunately for our affiliate, it has been one that we have had to grapple with far too often. The state of Alabama has paid out more than $1.7 million in attorney's fees. Those are our taxpayer dollars as a result of unconstitutional laws to restrict abortion access, and they continue to unfortunately come. We even have seen in this year's legislative session bills that were being filed to also restrict even access to medical abortions. But this is much more than an issue about abortion, if I'm being honest with you. This is also about an issue of medical autonomy, of the freedom to make choices about yourself and your body. And we believe, to be, topical here to this presentation today, that these are fundamental human rights, which we cannot see eroded. Next slide, please. So I'll just be very brief here. I think there'll be more opportunity to discuss and elevate some things going on in the 2021 legislative session. But we have this year been, of course, a bit challenged by the lack of access to the State House. However, adamant as ever and as strong as ever in making sure that we are pursuing priority legislation. And if we can move on to the next slide, I'll show you what some of those are. And so we spoke about some of these core areas already. But I just want to quickly touch on what some of these specific policies are that we're really rallying for or trying to fight. And so I've mentioned already to you the repeal of the habitual felony offender law, one of the harshest in the country. What we are really advocating for is for the repeal of this really draconian law in order to give the discretion and the power back to judges, those judges who originally sentenced these individuals. We want to give them the discretion again to review their cases, to say, hey, these have been, individuals who have been locked away for 15 years, 20 years. And, they can examine their records and their time. They can examine, how they have spent their time while they've been incarcerated. But what's important is that we have to give them a chance to be released and to be returned in order to lower the overcrowding, the unconstitutional overcrowding and conditions that are in our facilities today. And we really see this as a vehicle to addressing the ongoing prison crisis, which is also now the subject of litigation brought by the Trump Department of Justice across or against the state of Alabama for its unconstitutional prison conditions and abuses. And so we really see this as a vehicle. I also just want to touch on quickly the Vulnerable Child Compassion Protection Act, which we are fighting actively right now. These are bills that will strip transgender youth. I want to be clear about that. These are transgender kids of healthcare access. Again, this is not just an issue of opinions about transgender youth or about trans identity. This is an issue of healthcare access and medical autonomy. And finally, of course, on voting rights, I've mentioned this, and I think I was already pretty clear that we have a huge amount of work in front of us, but we believe that we have to modernize our voting rights laws and bring them up to speed with the rest of the country. And we can do that both locally and by way of HR 1 and other federal legislation.
Thank you so much, both Mr. Nettles and Ms. Bosby. We are preparing to enter into a panel discussion where we'll be able to highlight some of the issues that were brought forth by all three of our panelists. I will ask, because I hear it happening already, if you're not speaking or if you don't have a comment, to mute yourself and then just unmute once you are able to, or turn the volume down so that I'm not reflecting back. And I'm going to ask for those of you who are checking in with us on Facebook and via YouTube to please go ahead and drop your questions and or comments in the comment section, and we'll continue to monitor those for responses. Thank you, Ms. Woodard. I think it's a Ms. or Dr. Woodard for commenting that they're very happy. They are very happy to see that ASU is addressing pertinent human rights issues in our society. So thank you for that comment, and we're encouraging others to make comments and ask questions. So I have a few questions that I'd like to pose to the panel. And I think I'd like to start with just a couple of us. All of us are educators in some respect, right? A couple of us in this discussion are educating every day with students who have various levels of understanding. And so I'd like a couple of you to take to attempt to just give us a layman's definition. Y'all are brilliant and articulate, and you are able to, in a scholar's way, present this information. But if you were talking to my grandmama, who had all of a ninth grade education, how would you give us a layperson's definition on conceptualizing social inequality and social justice and human rights? And Dr. Robinson, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. I would say that sometimes as you move through this society and you see, for instance, like huge disparities in wealth, and you know that that's not right. I mean, where people are suffering from situations that can be addressed in terms of healthcare, in terms of mental health, in terms of substance abuse. Those are some of the things that, so that a normal person, as they move through the society, sees the different aspects of their environment, and it's clear some of the things that are just problematic and should not be, particularly in juxtaposition to the type of resources and the decisions that we make as a society to expend our resources on things that should not be as important in our society.
And I'm sorry.
And one of the things that I have some discussions with my colleagues about, and that is, we at the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State, have a number of programs looking at the vision of King, Martin Luther King, of this utopian society, the beloved community, right? And what does that mean? Right, so it's almost a utopia, but the idea is that we should be working towards that, right? So in a beloved community, do you have mass incarceration, right? In a beloved community, do you have the poisoning of our environment? In the beloved community, do you have race-based violence and disenfranchisement? And so we might not be able to solve these problems in our lifetime, but we should be committed to addressing them and committed to realizing this beloved community.
And I think that's an excellent segue into my next question is how do we then talk about the importance of organizing in this current socio-political climate where we have issues around LGBTQ rights, around body ownership, around identification ownership, around reproductive rights ownership. How do we speak to the importance of organizing in our current climate?
I'd love to address that question because I really think that these concepts of civil liberties and civil rights are frankly inextricably tethered to human rights and social justice, because these have been really the causes, or the movements rather, that have long been, I guess I'd say long before the formation of this country, shaped the principles by which our Constitution and our laws today are written. So, I think about this word inalienable, which is in the Declaration of Independence, and it really means that these are natural rights. This essential equality means that no one is born with a natural right to rule over others without their consent, right? And that government is then obligated to apply the law equally to everyone. And I don't think I have to explain to any of you that the framers, of course, missed the mark in many areas, and we know that they did not shape these laws with us all in mind. But there's been many amendments to the Constitution to also address that. But it is our work at the ACLU, and we really have to hold in both our left and right hand, right, of respect and regard for civil rights and civil liberties, because it is our work to ensure that the law is applied equally. And as Jatan even pointed out earlier, equitably to all people, to ensure that the law is not distorted or abused to violate, anyone's civil rights or civil liberties. And so when I think about this in the modern context of organizing, I think about how we are building, today, really following so much of the blueprint that we saw through the civil rights movement, but an issue or an effort today, an organization today that is addressing these issues, not just kind of on the surface level of saying, oh, this is a civil rights issue, we have to defend it because the Constitution protects people from this. No, this is a human rights issue, and this is actually about people's fundamental right to be who they are, to live as they are. And that's more of a value, it's more of a principle that I think shaped and was a part of the fundamentals of our frameworks of our Constitution and of our laws today, but have, through many attempts been attacked and been watered down.
Good point. And so as we try to concretize some of this, as we talk about the varied levels of civil and human rights and the diversity, right? Because there are cultural influences globally that determine when something is perceived as a right? And I'm talking beyond the Declaration of Human Rights. I'm talking about just as we as human beings see or understand or perceive a concept as a natural, inalienable right that a human being possesses. Can any of you talk a little bit about I don't want you to necessarily talk about the theory of intersectionality, but talk about how the understanding of the intersecting identities might influence our perception of what a human right is, what the most pertinent social issues are that we need to address.
Thank you. I can take some of this, Dr. Davis-May. And I think without going into the theory of intersectionality, I do think it is important to provide some context around it, right? So intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a civil rights attorney, and really talked about the legal loopholes and implications as she was doing a paper, I believe in 1989, to recognize a lawsuit by 5 Black women against General Motors, talking about a policy that was specifically targeted at Black women. And she spoke about the dynamics that you cannot negate sexual discrimination and racial discrimination. And that in and of itself is intersectional. And broadly, that conversation continues or really precedes that with the, I'm reading How We Get Free by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and the Combahee feminist collective, the Black feminist collective, and they talk about, again, intersectionality as it relates to their identity as women, their sexual identity, the socioeconomic factors that affect them, and how that is really what is at the forefront of how they interact in this world politically, and the struggles around that. And so when we talk about civil rights and civil liberties and who we are and what our inalienable rights are, it becomes very intersectional depending on our identity, whether we have other abilities, whether we identify as LGBTQ or Black or Brown or AAPI. All of those factors are about our identity and how we operate and are seen within the world and how things affect us. And so that is really the conversation about intersection and how we approach this work as it relates to human rights and civil liberties, but moreover, how it affects us as individuals and as community members.
Thank you. And we'll talk a little bit later, maybe offline, about if it's intersectional, like how do we bring other people on? Like how do we connect with the other folks who don't belong to those identities, who don't own those identities, and bring them on and help them to understand their role in engaging in this work. And we have Erin Narlock on, who has made a comment or asked two questions actually. And one of them is connected to a question I had, so I'm going to connect that in a second. But I'm going to start with her second question, which is, what is the role of private organizations when our government misses the mark?
And I think that falls right into the work of the ACLU. And I can sum it up pretty well, and it's really accountability. So when you have documents like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the ACLU always says those are our clients, and the truth of the matter is we are accountable to ensuring that there is a check and a balance. And we have to ensure that politicians are held accountable, that agencies and municipalities are held accountable when we are protecting rights and when we are advancing civil liberties. And so organizations like the ACLU operate and work as that check and balance. And we see that particularly in a state like Alabama with a very regressive legislature, with the challenges that we are constantly seeing, attacks on individuals at the ballot box in their right to protest and the right to be who they are. The ACLU comes in as that check and balance to ensure that we are protecting those individuals by any and all means necessary available to us, whether that is through litigation, whether that is ensuring and mobilizing communities to hold their own politicians accountable. And also, I would say in that direct advocacy. So even outside of the state house, what does it look like at your city council and your district attorney and the officials on the local level that affect you in every way? And that is the work of organizations like ours, but moreover, the work of community organizers and community-based advocacy organizations that don't always get that elevation. How are we as the ACLU supporting and elevating their work?
And I'd like to also respond to that, because I think she may have been speaking to corporations in particular rather than advocacy organizations. And I think part of what Reebok is doing currently is certainly one of the ways in which corporations can begin to support the work. Identifying those people who are community activists and those advocacy organizations that are doing the work already, helping to uplift and highlight, illuminate their work so that others begin to, other corporations recognize their responsibility, right, to the globe, that it doesn't just include, dropping a couple of scholarships. It means changing the way that the world works and runs. And so I certainly think that is, that Reebok is one of the models for some of that work. And there are some other organizations, certainly, but most recently, I think, particularly with the reinstitution of this Human Rights Award, Reebok is getting it right with this. The next question, which is I'm going to combine with the question that I had, she also asked, how can we encourage and support the youth? I'm not going to use that term, but from a mindset that isn't necessarily advocacy oriented, how can we help to encourage them to move towards advocacy as a responsibility, right? And given youth activism in the past, and the way that youth activism has always, not just in the civil rights movement that Dr. Robinson highlighted, but youth have always been at the center of any change that has happened in society. And so how do we help to take this generation and the next three? So, and I always confuse the generations, but from generation Y on millennial on, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we engage those generations? Really, Generation X hadn't done much either, but Generation X on to begin to enact this work that has to be done.
And I would just like a little framing, because I know that Dylan and Dr. Robinson will have a lot to bring to this, but I really want to name that I truly believe that Generation Z has helped us set the tone for how we look at activism and advocacy movement.
You're right. I
truly believe that the Black Lives Matter movement and what we are seeing take shape is a youth-led movement. And so I can't subscribe and say they have a slacktivist mindset. If anything, I think they are shifting the dynamic in the culture to bring us along on how we can be more active and how we can be advocates and how we can be more intentional about this work. And I think that they are setting the tone, and we can really follow their lead in conjunction with identifying the movement that has been born out of this city, and that we are seeing as simply a continuum and an arc on this broader spectrum. But I definitely want to name that the youth are leading us already, and many of us are being asked to get on board. So,
I think that's why I struggled. I'm sorry, Jatan. I think that's why I struggled with even saying the term, because I've not seen that. What I've seen is they're not doing it the way that we've wanted them to do it. Right? They're not, they might let us sit at the table, but they have a whole nother vision of how this work is going to get done. And we got to kind of move out the way. We got to give them a book, give them the lesson, explain the history, give them some context for the work, and then allow them to redirect. And that has been with every generation. It's not just this one. It's not just this one. Every generation that, when I talk with the elders in Lowndes County, they talk about how they did not want their children, the students from Calhoun and Central High School, to join the march. They talk about that. Right? They talk about how they didn't always agree with the way that the youth were beginning to engage and establish other mechanisms to get this work done. We know that here on Alabama State's campus, Dr. Robinson, not all of the faculty agreed with the way that the students and younger faculty were beginning to be a part of this process. So certainly this is our history. We have about one more minute.
I want to chime in on this.
I'm gonna give you 1 minute and then we're gonna have to close out.
Okay, I think that what you said is important. I think we missed something though. I agree that this generation has really taken some elements of the present day protest, eclipse what happened in the 1950s and 60s. There was no time in the 1950s and 60s where protests occurred in all 50 states, in nations across the world. But we also have to look at what is the goal, okay? And so in the 1950s and 60s, there were some set objectives, and that people, were working towards those objectives. Now, in Alabama,
we have 35 seconds. I'm sorry.
In Alabama State, there were professors who worked with young people, and there were other adults who worked with young people in terms of strategy and in terms of lobbying, and so to translate that energy into real legislative change. So the students really sat in on hearings to help shape the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So I think if there's anything that the elders could do today is to help young people translate that energy and that protest into actual policy and legislative changes.
They need a plan. They need a plan, a concentrated plan. And I think there are plans. I think not everyone has access to the plan, but I certainly agree with that. I think that's an excellent place to end. This has been wonderful. We needed 2 hours, you all. There's so much work to be done, so much history to learn still. Dr. Robinson, every time you speak, I hear something new, even though I've heard you speak 4 or 5 times. I appreciate you, Dylan Nettles, for your succinctness and clearly your energy as it relates to making sure that even the least of us, the most marginalized of us, have a voice. And Jatan, thank you so much for being able to just kind of concretize all of this information. I know that you needed all this hour for yourself in order to be able to give us what we needed. But this was a just a thick snack, an hors d'oeuvre, right? It was filling just enough, and we're going to want some more later. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Dr. Amende. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Thank you, Ms. Brown. I see some students on. You all have a blessed day. I know that Destiny is probably having a conniption because we're 1 minute and 20 seconds over our time. So we will be in touch with you all. If you all have any questions, you can continue to drop them on Facebook. And if Dr. Robinson, Mr. Nettles, and Ms. Bowlesby would be kind enough to kind of go back and check later on to respond to any questions that people have, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you all. Have an awesome remainder to your week.
Thank you.